It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. The independent reviewer of terrorism legislation in the UK, David Anderson, has resigned from his position after 6 years. The barrister is well known for traveling across the country seeking the views of different groups of people in response to the UK government's anti-terror and anti-radicalization laws. Just as he stepped down from his post, Mr. Anderson suggested that the government's anti-radicalization program could work properly if it was reformed. Here's what he had to say.
This is a program that is simply not trusted by a very large number of decent British Muslims. One thing they need to do is do a much better job of explaining what they are doing, what the basis is for the interventions that they're making, what the training materials say, what is their metric for success. I think they also have to do a better job, particularly nationally, of engaging with a wider range of Muslims.
Joining us today to discuss these programs and David Anderson's resignation and his position as the most recent watchdog that has resigned. And we want to discuss all of this with Arzu Merali. Ms. Merali is co-founder of Islamic Human Rights Commission, and she co-authored Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the UK. Thank you so much for joining us today, Arzu.
Thank you for having me on.
So Ms. Merali is co-founder of Islamic Human Rights Commission, and she has co-authored a number of articles, including Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the UK. So Arzu, let's begin with why Mr. Anderson stepped down and what is the significance of it?
I think there's a law developing at the moment that somehow David Anderson was frustrated with the limitations on him in the post that he was holding. In particular, he has spoken many times about the policies that surround the anti-terrorism laws, in particular the prevent policy, which is now statutory duty, which actually falls outside of the remit of the role he held. So there are indications that there were some frustrations there and so on and so forth. Whether that's the truth of the matter, I'm not in a position to say, but because I think there has been a more sympathetic reception for Anderson within civil society, definitely than for his predecessor, this kind of stories are abounding. Having said that, for people like myself, coming from civil society and activist perspectives on the issue of the anti-terrorism laws, we're not sure really what the significance of that is, because the position itself is so ring-fenced in terms of what it can do and what it has done, regardless of who's been in the post, that really these sort of small, moments are of little significance, actually.
Right. Tell us a better sense of the anti-radicalization project and why it's significant, and what was Anderson talking about in that clip in terms of if it was reformed, it could be more effective. What did he mean by that?
But I have to say, first of all, that, whilst he was in post for most of the time, he sounded more critical than actually his parting comments suggest, and that's been alarming for a lot of us. He's essentially talking about what is called the PREVENT program. There are other facets of a four-pronged approach by the government, but it's the PREVENT program of anti-radicalization or de-radicalization that is the focus of most controversy. And this started out as a program encouraging people to essentially report on people they feared were at risk of radicalization. What that means, nobody knows, and therefore you had a lot of very subjective, prejudiced referrals to anti-radicalization and de-radicalization programs. In particular, Channel, which is supposedly a de-radicalization program, where a lot of people, in particular children and students, have been referred to over the years. Now, since that has become law for over a year ago, the referrals have risen exponentially, and there have been many cases coming to light that are really so ludicrous. You couldn't make them up if you were writing a comedy. Children as young as 4 being referred because they drew a picture of a cucumber clock, and somehow the teacher had cooker bomb called the police without even informing the parents of the child, and so on and so forth. Now, Anderson has basically said that there isn't a problem with the program. That's what his parting comments in the article he's written has basically discussed. It's just that there is a kind of misperception amongst Muslims in particular that there is something, they feel there's something shady or discriminatory or, it's a bit opaque, therefore we should have, his argument is we should have more transparency, therefore people would buy into it and accept it. So his idea is to make something that is actually deeply criticized by members of civil society as essentially rolling out a surveillance state and creating a police state, because ultimately Muslims in particular have found themselves policing their thinking, their activities, and so on as a result of this program. Rather than saying this is a problem, he is really simply talking about making a little bit more accountable to Muslims, or a bit more transparent, and then they would see that it's actually working properly. And there's a huge dissonance here between what people on the ground are feeling and unfortunately what the watchdog, which a lot of them put their hope in, actually sees to be the operation of this program.
And give us a sense of what exactly is the difference between the UK's anti-terror laws on one hand and then the anti-radicalization laws and strategies on the other.
Okay, so the strategies in themselves are, the policies were developed on the side of the law and then were eventually made a statutory duty in terms of prevent, as I said, about 15, 16 months ago. The laws themselves have been hugely contributory to things like stop and search, increases in that on the basis of being suspected as a terrorist. At various points in time, there are things to do with detentions without charge, and so on and so forth. And whilst many of these facets have been overturned, we still have things which are effectively control orders, which are house arrests. So people can be detained in their homes, again, effectively without charge. They are somehow curtailed in their movements. They have electronic tagging and so on and so forth. And the restrictions on them apply to their families. They are often, denied access to internet and even banking facilities. We have families in the UK who, under suspicion of terrorism, have to actually have no access to their own personal finances and bank accounts and have to submit shopping lists to the Treasury actually on a weekly basis to have money approved to be given to them from their own accounts. So there's any number of punitive and draconian measures that are legislated for. The prevent policy, which is effectively named as a program of deradicalization, encourages the pinpointing of people thought to be a problem and then referring them on to something called Channel in the worst instance, which is a deradicalization program. Channel itself is completely opaque. We don't really know what's going on there. People who go into it have to sign confidentiality policies. We have a few stories of what may or may not be going on in there. And those things then exist in a sort of grey area outside the specificities of the law. And that's where an awful lot of problems are arising, regardless of, the punitive and draconian measures that are purely enacted under the law itself.
Now, Arzu, in your most recent article, you state that the Islamic Human Rights Commission used to participate in the consultation with the government on its terror laws, but no longer. Why are you not participating? What is preventing them from having a consultative process?
What has happened now for a long time, and it's been actually the position of our organisation and in the beginning many others, that we protested the introduction of any anti-terror laws on the basis that there are sufficient laws under the criminal code of this country to prosecute the type of crimes that supposedly anti-terrorism laws were supposed to be tackling, whether it's mass murder, conspiracy to commit murder or other offences, etc. Now that conversation has become increasingly lost, and the consultation process starts becoming simply about the technicalities of whatever is the latest law. So you're in a position where you are often trying to criticize the overarching premise of the law, and yet nothing of that is reflected in the consultation. And the more you participate, effectively, you are simply just then allowing the government to say, well, we have widely consulted on this law, X, Y, and Z have, taken part in the consultation, and now we are done. Here is the new law. We felt that we absolutely have to take a step back and find another way to open up the space to have a really proper conversation about what is the utility of these pieces of law within our society? Why do we keep having new versions that are curtailing, in the first instance, the rights, the political aspirations, and so on and so forth of Muslims in the United Kingdom, but ultimately, actually, all citizens are being affected by these measures. So we no longer wanted to be part of what was turning into a rubber stamping exercise, and we definitely wanted to be able to try and find another space to have conversations that desperately need to be had.
Right, and when you say other citizens are also affected by these laws, what do you mean by that?
Well, on the one hand, now we find when we're having leaks of information here, there, and everywhere that, for example, several police forces have earmarked environmental groups as domestic terrorists. Okay, so the net is being cast wider when it comes to political dissent. So it's gone way beyond just, Muslims protesting about X, Y, or Z, whether it was the Iraq war, whether it was Palestine, whether it was about anything in the UK. It's now covering a wide net of people. But because we've had this kind of culture created where, securitization becomes a justification for all sorts of modifications to our privacy laws, we now find that, there is more scope for all sorts of digital surveillance, et cetera, which ultimately affects everybody, the quote unquote, normal citizen of the United Kingdom who probably thought, well, these measures are to, sort out the Muslim problem or whatever problem, are now also subject to all this kind of scrutiny.
Right. All right, Arzu, I thank you so much for joining us today, and a very important issue you're working on, and we'll keep an eye on it and we'll come back to you sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.